Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're exploring whether Canada is experiencing what's known as the Great Resignation and asking whether the nonprofit sector is still seen as a desirable career path. Or has burnout in inequitable workplaces caused a large exodus from the sector and high turnover, especially at the leadership level? Joining me today is Jim Moss, Executive Director of YMCA WorkWell at YMCA of Three Rivers. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you for having me.
So I think it would be great if you could start to explain what the YMCA WorkWell actually is. Could you tell us about what your purpose is and the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, certainly. So the YMCA historically has always existed to support the well-being of members of our communities where we exist, but never met those communities in their workplace. So we've always met with people as individuals or members of a family. And so it's a bit of a B2C, right? Like they're consumers and they're citizens. YMCA WorkWell is a kind of a first of its kind for the YMCA, where we're saying there's all sorts of data and research that's telling us that the workplace is having a negative impact on people's health and well-being. And so instead of waiting for them to need our treadmill to run their stress off, can we go and support organizations to breed healthier, happier, kind of higher performing workplace cultures where employees can, do important work, but not have it come at such a great personal expense. And so we offer a number of products and services. We generally start with data collection to understand how an organization's workforce is feeling and to help to identify which things are predicting more or less health pressure, burnout, etc. And then we have a constellation of consulting services, training and development, coaching to help to respond to that. So we really don't like data just for data's sake. We like data to help us understand where to start and how to get down to action, but knowing that no organization can kind of do everything all at once. And right now they're all a little bit more burned out than they would love to be. So if you can't do much, what are the one or a few important things that you could do that could have a very positive impact on people's health and well-being in the workplace?
Yeah, and I'd like to get to some of those tips that you have and those recommendations for organizations, but I'd like to dive into the data first and find out really, you certainly collected a lot of data over the past year related to how the pandemic is impacting Canadian workers. Can you give us a big picture on how the mental health of Canadian workers has evolved in the past 2 years?
Yeah, so fortunately, we have some historical data from prior to the pandemic. And then we were able to capture some what we thought was early, right? And then what we thought would have been later, but is really just less early. So we've got a few time points now to look at how was the workforce doing generally before, very early on, and then as the pandemic has progressed. Hopefully we'll be able to one day say, and this is how we looked, a year after the pandemic had subsided. Basically, what we found was that people's overall well-being, and so when you ask somebody a question about their self-reported well-being, they have a tendency to answer with a heavier leaning towards their physical health, right? What they think of as their physical health. So then we would ask as well about their mental health and their social health and their familial health. What we found was that scores declined by roughly 25% on average very quickly in the pandemic. And we went from, if I recall correctly, it was about, we doubled the number of people who were reporting themselves as unhealthy and cut in half the number of people who were reporting themselves as healthy. So a very big, significant decline in terms of what were the average scores. We use a 100-point scale because we plan to follow people along over time and we want to see micro volatility. But unfortunately, we haven't seen much of that micro volatility. So very early on, we saw this decline where twice as many people were reporting themselves as being unhealthy, mentally unhealthy, etc., and half as many as being healthy. And then when we measured again 6 months later and 12 months later and now 18 months later, there has been no change. So what we expected was a bit more bouncing back, like natural resilience as we learn to baseline to this new normal. But what we saw was something quite different. So, we'll talk about this more later, I'm sure, but frontline workers versus knowledge workers who maybe worked from home, right? You might have expected that one group stayed healthier than the other. But what we actually found was that over time, both groups ended up looking pretty much the same and unhealthy, but for very different reasons and needing different things. And because they had been through a lot of change and there was still that uncertainty. So very, very large impact on very, very many people. Younger people at first were impacted much more negatively. So people in their 20s and early 30s, people with families, I think for a lot of kind of obvious reasons. And then we saw a bit of an insulation. So as you went up the age demographic, once you got over 50 and over 60, there was still some impact, but very marginal by comparison to younger people. And so, treating lots of different demographics and groups in different ways, some that seem obvious and some that were less obvious, but really quite significant impacts.
Well, your data also seem to support the contention that the nonprofit sector is experiencing what we're calling the Great Resignation, or was actually getting close to doing so. Your report expressly says the sector is experiencing the start of the Great Resignation, with employees leaving their jobs in record numbers and the rise of the burnout epidemic. So I've used a quotation from your report to sort of emphasize what it is that you were saying. What could you tell us about the data that you have to support this, and perhaps we could then explore what leaders need to be aware of as they're facing this?
Yeah, that's right. So as part of our assessment, so we work with companies, right? But then we also do a large scale community data collection where we can ask the types of questions that you might not be able to ask as easily within the construct of an employment relationship. When we ask the community and we're able to then slice that data up and look at all the folks who work in the not-for-profit or in mission-driven types of organizations, what we found was, I think it was almost 3x the number of people considering leaving their job in the next 6 months, and twice as many people who had left their job in the past 6 months than prior to the pandemic. So really, really significant shift. Either have already changed or are considering it. And so, you can't go back and recapture those people who have already left, right? But can we learn lessons from why? What was the deal breaker? And can we still make a change, a positive change for those people who are maybe heading towards the door, but they're not out the door yet? There's all sorts of reasons why this should be important. Obviously, I think in the not-for-profit sector, we care about our employees as much or more than anybody else. It takes a special person to do the type of work that so many of our not-for-profits do, a caring person who's interested in more than just a paycheck, obviously. And, there's not an endless supply of people ready to refill those jobs and those roles. So what we know is that one of the most surprising things, it's not really surprising when I say it, but when we're looking at the data, how starkly it jumped off the page, was one of the greatest predictors of why somebody would leave or is considering leaving is that they feel underappreciated. So we expected to see that their well-being was under pressure, and that may be compounded by their experience of work, but it's also, for the first time, we've got this macro mega event, which is the pandemic, sending everybody to work, less healthy than they would like to be. But through a number of different reasons in the experience of work, people are feeling less valued. And so as the well-being goes down, and then what we find this next trailing indicator is people reporting that they feel less valued in the work that they're doing. And there's a big management gap in understanding human psychology and even workplace culture in tactical ways. And so we've teased that apart. And so one example would be, we tend to provide recognition first, which should be, what did you do? I'm grateful that you did this thing that is part of how we accomplish our goals around here in our organization. But on the other side of that, which is a little bit closer to the individual's identity, is a need to feel valued. And so it's appreciation. And appreciation, in a nutshell, comparing it to engagement, instead of what you did, it's who you are and why you do the work the way you do it. It's what you bring to it specifically that adds value to the customer experience or whatever it is that you're doing. And when we get busy and burned out as leaders, for example, some of that sugar doesn't flow out to the people who need to feel, that they're sweet. And so we tend to like give it out in a batch. So like at the end of a shift, hey, everybody, great shift today. Well, that doesn't say what Mary did really well or what Jim did really well that made this shift go great. And so the human brain doesn't take away the same type of feeling of being valued. And so that is when we look at how do we understand the data in an action orientation, right? With things that you can do. Can we then share that insight and help organizations really quickly make people feel more valued? Because it's a string that tethers us to the mission and the organization. As we feel less valued, we kind of drift farther away from feeling like my actions matter to the delivery of my organization's mission. And if all of a sudden I'm just another number in the group, well, then you won't miss me. And if I'm feeling a little worn out and, maybe I don't need this income, or maybe I'm been thinking about a career change, as I feel less and less valued, it seems to predict that I'm more likely to act in that way.
So your data actually had shown you asked people who had left why they left, or if they were thinking of leaving, why it was that they were thinking of leaving. And it came down to something, fundamentally as basic about human nature, about feeling appreciated as a person and being able to, I guess, comfortably bring themselves, their whole selves to work and be appreciated for who they were and what they contributed.
It doesn't sound so surprising when you say it just the way that you did.
No, but I do think that leaders sometimes think it's much more complex than that, and and in many respects, I think this could be good news for leaders because it does seem as though it's things that they could shift in terms of their management style and what they're doing for their workers, as opposed to having some huge infrastructure change that I think a lot of leaders feel must be required when you're facing this kind of departure from the workplace. Would you agree? Am I getting it right?
Yeah, you really are. So even before the pandemic, we have a tendency to find that organizations always look for the more complicated intervention or adjustment. It's like, we love big projects that are never really going to happen the way that we drew them up on the whiteboard, but they make us feel good because it feels like a more complicated response should have a better outcome. But the probability of success of that really complicated approach usually has it kind of drop down below what would be meaningful in terms of the impact. And so we're always looking we kind of start with human psychology because we're all humans and we have, we're all very unique and special unicorns, but we have a lot of shared needs, right, that are part of managing our identity, et cetera. And there's a massive gap in leadership of understanding that, which is why they go past relationships, for example, and meaningful relationships, not just, bare minimum type of manager relationships. And so you're exactly right. So it is very commonly much more simple things that you could just do better starting tomorrow. And it's not even always a very big knowledge gap. It's the doing gap, right? So knowing to appreciate people and what it isn't rocket science. You could figure that out. Building it into your management practice is actually the more challenging part. And in the pandemic, if I look at HR teams and I look at leadership teams, especially in the not-for-profit sector, they were under so much pressure for so long. And it went from intense and acute to a very chronic type of response where we're continuing to have to make these hard choices and to figure out what to do next with less revenue, less donations, etc. And so as they get worn out, some of that time and energy where appreciation might have flowed is gone, right? Not to mention the fact that we're working remotely. And so after our meeting, Mary, if we were in person, I might walk down the hall with you. And that's the chance for me to say, wow, did you ever, you always impress me when you do that thing that you always do. And there's like a little unit of appreciation that gets transferred in the kind of soft tissue that makes in-person workplaces valuable. And some of that has gone away. So we've lost some of the mechanical ability to do that and the energetic capacity to do these things that matter so much to individuals. And when they're already hurting, it can be enough to kind of push them across the line.
I want to dig a little deeper into the mental health piece of this as well. Your survey talks about the dire state of the sector and the mental health of the people within it. And I'm going to quote you now, or your report. Employees in our communities are exhausted, overworked, and depleted, and these realities are directly contributing to the biggest challenges our workforces are facing. It's burning employees out, it's pushing employees to leave their jobs, and it's directly impacting mental health in our communities. That is extremely concerning, and
Mm-hmm.
I do understand your whole point around just showing appreciation can go a long way, but surely in a circumstance like this, we need better tools or more resources. Would you agree? And if so, could you explain what those might be?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that for a number of reasons, people's mental health is pressured depending on who they are, their experience of life, but then specific to the work too. Some people's work has been significantly more stressful or been altered more significantly. That leads us towards burnout. Burnout is a bit misunderstood in itself. Burnout is the inability to manage workplace stress in a healthy way. So effectively, you start to move into a loss position where you can't maintain and overcome the stress in a reasonable amount of way week after week after week. And so it's a chronic condition. So stress is something. It shows up in things like cynicism, right? Where we start to check out mentally. We become a little bit less engaged as a protection mechanism. And then an escalation is we start to actually speak negatively about people, about customers, about coworkers, about whatever. Those are some of the hallmarks that burnout is settling in. But we also know that, and to your point, the pandemic, for a number of reasons, really increased anxiety for a lot of people. And in our second to last report, we actually were calling it the isolation and loneliness pandemic. And that was a significant stage that happened before we kind of had an opportunity to at least get out a little bit. And loneliness and isolation is a really strong predictor of depression and mental health, significant mental health concerns. So it's important to say that things like appreciation aren't going to solve for somebody's depression, right? So once people get far enough down that mental health spectrum, they need access to the traditional supports, doctors and trained professionals. We tend to treat this in a really one-size-fits-all way. So, for example, EAPs, right, and benefits packages, which people need to use. What we found was, so some examples would be people who had already used a mental health service were more likely to then engage it when they needed it. But for very many people, their mental health had been fine, and the pandemic puts them in a position where for the first time they need to access services and supports. And if they don't have that pre-existing trusted relationship or the fluency to feel like this is worth the risk that I have to take to put my hand up and say, I think I'm depressed, and create a new relationship with a healthcare provider to get the service that I need, then they're significantly less likely to use it. And so some of it, unfortunately, is it's too late to start when we need it, right? And so we need to be taking a responsibility to help people just to not get that far, to where they need real clinical supports, and to where we have to burn out. And then we need very different tools. So a really great example would be in some of the data that we collected, where we actually asked some EDI or JADE questions as well. And what we found is that the benefits and the mental health supports that we were providing were working very well for a large majority of our organization. But our LGBTQ2S plus community didn't feel that way at all. And so they needed an entirely different type of mental health benefit package. And so we had to go out and look for, does that exist, right? You need to know how big that percentage of your population is and be collecting the data to know that that group needs something very different than what you're offering. And so the historical days of these big packages that are kind of one size fits all, I think those days are very far behind us. And so we need to be rethinking benefits and supports in a much more targeted way. And we need to know more than just how many people are using it. Are the people who really need it getting it? And so we need to go, it's a little bit like donations, right? And it's a little bit like the service that we provide as not-for-profits. It's one thing to know how many people we served, just quantity. We need to know who that really needed our services the most got the service that they need. So how many people did we kind of impact in a mile wide but an inch deep way? And how many people did we make the really deep but needed impact? And we need to think that way about our employees as well.
Well, I'd like to go a little deeper in the DEI space, to talk a little bit about what we've heard anecdotally from other people in the nonprofit that work with nonprofit organizations, and that we've heard anecdotally that nonprofit organizations' failure to provide equitable and inclusive workplaces are another cause for workers exiting their jobs or the sector. Like at some point, it's just became too uncomfortable, and it was not a place that was supportive of underrepresented groups or
Right.
people who identify as being part of an underrepresented group and are looking for more equity and inclusion in the workplace and being able to bring their whole self to work. You clearly have just spoken about that in terms of your own organizations looking into the services that were being offered in terms of mental health supports. Did you actually come across that kind of data in the surveys that you collected?
Yeah, so we in our community surveys, we asked a number of demographic questions that allowed us to look at smaller groups, minority groups, and different types of different groups who identify in different ways. And we found a number of really compelling trends. So first of all, what you said about this as an additional spectrum that is impacting many people in pushing them towards the door or having them rethink their relationship is very much true from everything that we can tell. And so we think that those people have experienced this historically for a very, very long time, systemically. And so they're almost closer to the door already. And as other things start to pile on, it can break that relationship faster, differently, right? And then I think, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, really emerged and society was lit on fire in a whole other and needed way, which was a complicating factor in the middle of a pandemic, but also super important because look at all of the work that's, maybe starting or getting funded better to change some of these outcomes. What we found was if you identified yourself as marginalized in any one way, you were significantly more likely to feel disengaged, feel lower levels of trust, to be likely to consider leaving your role. And if you happen to have two ways in which your identity had you be a member of a minority group or a marginalized group, it was really quite significant. So, if we looked at race, if we looked at gender, some of the things that we might think of more commonly, if there was an added complication of a health, a neurological disability, or something else as well, it really pushed people farther away. And so I think it's twofold. I think, first of all, we need to be disaggregating data to understand not just how the majority might be feeling, but how the smaller groups are feeling and why is that different. We need to really own our part, in why that has happened. And having got into some of this work, it's not a quick process. And so, there are people that you're going to lose because you can't make a big enough change fast enough, even if you're making a very significant investment of time and energy and funds, et cetera. But it needs to start, because there are people who are willing to, that you need to be a part of that process and are willing to tell you what you need to hear. But also, if we go back to the Great Resignation, there's all sorts of jobs opening up. And what we don't want is mechanical diversity, where we just try to have our workforce look different. What we want is, how do we build a culture that attracts those people? And so where they're coming towards a workplace experience that they're likely to enjoy and benefit from and be able to contribute towards equally. If we just try to mechanically change the workforce, there's no reason to believe that they're going to, receive anything different than the people before them who have already maybe left or are thinking about leaving. And so this is really about culture, right? Is our culture attracting a diverse workforce? And when we attract those people, do they have an equal experience? And if not, how do we do both of those things? And a bit of a loop, because if you do a great job of attracting a diverse workforce and giving them what they need to flourish, they're the best people to then, attract the next layer of candidates. And it'll be their trusted recommendation, which has so much more power than whatever we're going to put into a job description.
Yeah, essentially they become ambassadors of that workplace that has that kind of culture. I totally understand that can be so important for recruitment. I also wanted to, all of this sounds pretty daunting from the perspective of a leader, right? There's so much going on at the same time and so many pressures and challenges. We heard, as part of this Great Resignation, from, again, anecdotally from those who work with nonprofit organizations, that there's a large number of nonprofit leaders that have resigned during the pandemic, or retiring, or have, accelerated their retirement during the pandemic, because they just they didn't buy into that when they, took their leadership role, that they would be doing it during a pandemic and with all these other challenges. Have you seen anything like that in terms of your data?
So in our data, so something that makes not-for-profits, and we refer to mission-driven organizations as well. They might be for-profit, but they kind of look more like a not-for-profit in the data and the way that they operate. In not-for-profits, more specifically, we see a much higher average tenure. So people tending to work for a very long time for an organization that they align with, and so less likely to change more generally under normal times, which that sets up the paradigm for more people to be closer to retirement, right? Or, hit those magic numbers, 10, 15 years, 20 years, and think, well, maybe there's still time for me to do something else for a while, or to go into semi-retirement. So I think we've seen that play out, and it will continue to play out. I think that there's another very significant wave that we should be mindful of, which is people who have made the choice to probably leave, but they're not going to leave your organization in the state that it might be in at this point, 2 years into the pandemic. And so their loyalty is going to help keep them there to help you get across the river, hopefully. and then they will be looking for an opportunity to exit when they feel like that won't be so damaging to the organization. Whereas the others maybe didn't have that same connection and left, or maybe their health or their personal situation put them in a position to leave sooner. So I think, first of all, I think there's a really big significant risk of another large percentage of leaders with that loyalty to stay, but might go, which means that there's still a chance to keep them as well. The other thing is, about 6 months ago, we saw, for the first time in the history of data collection that we've been doing, which is over a decade, we saw leader health and well-being decline below frontline staff. And that is like, it really is remarkably outlying to see. And it was quite sad to see, and kind of sobering, because what that means is decision-making power is now under pressure. It's harder to make good and important decisions day in and day out. And so you can imagine more people needing to take time off, take a leave, take a knee, go on disability. And it's not easy to replace leaders for short-term or long-term. Another really major complicating factor for not-for-profits is we haven't always been great about training and development. And so, we don't have as much money. We don't have as many people, right? We're always generally a little bit under-resourced from where we might ideally like to be. And so it's not uncommon that there's a bit of an organizational deficit in leadership development, which means that when that leader leaves or takes a knee, we might not have somebody really ready to go and step into that role. That doesn't mean that's always the case. It just means that the probabilities are maybe a bit lower than for-profit organizations that are really paying attention to this stuff and planning in the long term. So there's a bunch of complicating factors in there. I think that there are some important actions that leadership teams can be taking. First of all, they need to be checking in with each other and opening up the channels and having self-reflection and having humility to say, I'm not my best this week or next week. So I just came back from a 6-week leave. So this is me. And it was due to some family health matters that were putting pressure on me and needed more of my attention for a period of time. We need to create more options, which is something we can do. Like tomorrow morning, we could have a meeting and decide more options. So instead of it needing to be all or nothing, does somebody need a few weeks of 70% weeks, right? Do we need to promote somebody who's on the way up a little bit further up and give them some more responsibilities and reward them and be willing to spend a little to shore ourselves up, right? And to take some of that leader or manager workload and spread it out to somebody who might be ready to go there. And so, spending a little bit of money or a little bit more money to give us more safety, but also to value that leader's health and well-being equally. If we don't do that, that second complication that I said, where people are going to get across the river and then exit, is more likely to happen. What we know from a physical health and mental health standpoint is we can get through really hard things for a period of time, right? Like, we're built highly resilient as humans. In fact, we kind of underestimate how resilient. And so we responded very quickly in incredible ways, societally. It was really quite something to see. And not-for-profits, that held true for not-for-profits as well. But when you continue to act in an acute type of way to what is now becoming a chronic situation, you cannot run on adrenaline endlessly. And so the body starts to exhibit what's called adrenal fatigue, all sorts of things where, if you've ever gone through like a really hard time, like we just moved into a new house, you can make it to the end of the move, and then you get sick 5 days afterwards when your body starts to say like, okay, I can store the toxins here for a while, but at some point I need to flush them out, and then we get sick. There's this, I think we're building a deficit in leadership well-being that we're not paying attention to. We've seen organizations do things like shut down for a week, which is good. Um, we've seen a lot of like kind of throwing a stone at it. But if you take a week off, but you just come back to the same workload that was there, very quickly you find yourself right back in the same situation. And so, another major finding in the data collection was the workload. The manageable workload is one of the top needs of people who are unhealthy, people with lower net promoter scores, people who are thinking about leaving, and leaders as well. One of the things that we need to think about is, what can we not do for a while? Like, do we know our priorities with the type of clarity that we can really zero in on delivering on the top three? And we might have to let number 4 and 5 go for a little while, because that might be what saves leaders and teams and allows them to keep delivering on 1, 2, and 3. And it's just unrealistic to keep trying to do all 5 things right now where we find ourselves. And so that's a pretty sobering gut check for a lot of organizations. And if you're a not-for-profit, that might mean segments that you can't service as well, or not having as many centers open, or not having your doors open, for as long every day as they are. But we kind of come back to that. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first. If the organization has to shutter entirely because we weren't willing to just reduce service a little bit and survive, those are hard, sobering decisions that leaders can absolutely make if they're willing to deal with it face on.
It certainly is sobering. I would really like to give you an opportunity to look at those 2 reports that you mentioned, the community report and then the report about loneliness and isolation. And if you could distill what you've learned from that into some actionable advice for leaders or organizations, what is it that you would want to highlight?
Probably the first one is keep communicating, keep hyper communicating. So we've seen the priority of leader communication kind of go down a bit, but still stay in the top 3 or the top 5. People in a period of this kind of prolonged uncertainty, they want to know that what it is that they need to know, and that channel is strong. And, if you think about it, we were hearing from the prime minister or the provincial leaders every single day. Like, that hasn't happened in my entire lifetime. It was kind of wartime level communication, and it set a new standard of expectation. And the more uncertainty we have, the more that we want to know that there's this channel open. So keep over communicating. And it doesn't need to be just the CEO or the CAO or the senior leader. It can be anybody in a leadership position, but just keeping communication channels open. One of the things that we continue to see, which makes perfect sense, is that people are missing team connection, right? So we're humans, and we've been working in a slightly less human way. Very many of us, either isolated, working at home, or working in one location and used to commingling with other locations, but not able to because of COVID restrictions. And so team connection opportunities is another thing that people really are asking for. And it's not something we can give them today. But what we've been telling organizations is that doesn't mean you don't talk about it. What it means is you plan and you communicate that at the very first opportunity, we're going to make every effort we can to deliver on improving team connection opportunities. There's a tendency like, we can't do anything about it, so we're just going to avoid it. Whereas if people know, that allows me to kind of close the file in my mind a little bit and say, well, Mary's on it, and she's going to make it a priority the minute that she's allowed to do that. And so tell people that that they want to get back together, and that you're making plans for that to happen. The work from home, work from work, work from wherever, make a decision and be decisive. If you're clear, then own whatever your decision is for how your organization is going to work for a period of time. Give people certainty and let people make a choice about whether that's what they want or not. And if you aren't certain, then be willing to experiment. And don't say that this is what we're going to do forever, or this is what we're going to absolutely do. Say, for a period of time, we're going to try it like this to accommodate as many people as we can, and we're going to try and learn from that, and then figure out our best steps going forward. If you're the type of organization that has to have people back in the physical workspace or wants to, own that and set yourself up and get to work on doing that really, really well. And if there are people who no longer feel safe, try your very best to help them leave in a dignified way to find a place that will be better suited to their current needs. And if you're going to allow people to work from home and be flexible, figure that out and start investing in it, because there's still time, but you could screw it up really badly and lose a lot of great people just because you don't deal with that absolute certainty head on. We saw there was one organization who was really committed to coming back to their physical space. They just built a big, beautiful building. People really enjoyed it, but we're not the same workforce, right? Like, just because I loved it when we were in healthy times doesn't mean that I want to come back to it if I've got somebody at home that I need to be more worried about. And so they started to lose some talent that was getting poached from another organization, who was going to go completely remote. And so they were very concerned. Then I said, well, have you gone to their workforce and looked for all the people who still want to show up and work at a desk every day with other people? Because they're going to be alienating a very significant portion of their organization who might now be looking for another place to work. You could almost end up just trading, right? But inside of that is a really important seed, I think, which is super actionable, which is the workforce has changed. They're not the same people that they were before. And so your assumptions of who they were need to change and need to be updated with new information. And your assumptions about who you should be hiring probably need to change as well, based on that reality. And there's one other little gem in there, which is a actionable HR kind of strategy. If there are lots of people out there looking or considering to leave whatever organization they're at, right? They might not be the type of people who have been lining up at your door historically. And so sending out the same message to try and attract the people that you have historically tried to attract as talent is probably not going to find those people who are on the market potentially now, but you haven't built an HR strategy to tap into them. And so one of the trends that we would see from a period of time like this is more people who maybe have been working in for-profit. So something like a global pandemic or an individual life event has you stop and think about, where do I get value? And it's not only a paycheck. And so there will be very many people thinking about wanting to do something more meaningful. And so potentially not traditional, not-for-profit employees who might be willing to come in and take a pay cut and bring their skill set in. But you've got to go and find them. They're not going to come and look for you, and you're probably not marketing to them right now. And there may be some great people out there who might help this existing leadership team that you've got that's a little broken and bruised, and bring a little bit of new energy and new experience in. But we've got to think about, what do they need to hear from us to know that we could be a great place for them to work? And that's not what we've been talking about maybe historically.
I know that it'll be so helpful for sector leaders and the organizations, to get through and navigate this very challenging time, and whichever direction it goes and when it ends, which of course is an ongoing question, but certainly, your advice and insights have really given a lot of things to ponder about, but also some great solutions as well. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Just make sure that people feel a sense of hope. It's not lost, right? There's actions we can take. There are things that we can do.